screen: Zephaniah, Josiah, Jeremiah, friendship, reformation, disappointment and tragedy. So it's pretty big, but I'm going to do my best to get you to bed early tonight. So here we are, right at the end of the history of Judah. We've become familiar, of course, with these charts now, but you see the collection of prophets that sit above this period of time. So we have Zephaniah and Habakkuk and Nahum and Joel and Jeremiah and Daniel and Obadiah and Ezekiel. So there's a concentration of prophets in this area of the history of Judah. And there are good reasons for that, of course, because this nation is about to go into captivity because of the apostasy of Manasseh. So what was the ecclesia like when Ammon was killed by his own courtiers, and the people of the land then killed those courtiers? Now we think maybe that Ammon was killed by his own courtiers because he went back to the apostasy of his father, and people said, no, we're not going to have that. But then you see the people of the land who were corrupted by that apostasy took vengeance on those courtiers. However, Yahweh was at work here. There was a prophecy to be fulfilled, wasn't there? It was the prophecy of the man of God from Judah, who had mentioned Josiah's name several centuries before. It's an amazing thing, isn't it, the way the hand of God works. So what was it like to be in the ecclesia of those days? Judah was steeped in Babylonian idolatry and worldly practice. They were insensitive. After nearly 60 years of apostasy, they were under irrevocable sentence of divine judgment, and only a small remnant surrounding Josiah remained faithful. The attitude, of course, to reform was lukewarm and hypocritical. You know the passage in Jeremiah 3 verse 10, don't you? That Judah has turned unto me feignedly, says Yahweh through Jeremiah. So, they were prepared to wear the mask of, doing the right thing, but underneath it was just a facade. Underneath they were deep down corrupt. And that was the sad thing that Josiah had to confront. All his efforts were to come to nothing for most of those people because of that fact. So here he is, Josiah the youthful reformer. As you obviously are aware by now, his name means Yahweh, his foundation. And how true that was. He was to reign for 31 years from the age of 8. He was to die at age 39 by divine blessing. And it was a divine blessing that brought him to the end of his life before he reached 40. So most of us, of course, are looking to that day. Those of you young fellows looking to the day when you turn 40. There's a few of us who have sort of gone past that. But 40, when I got to 40, I sort of thought, well, this is crunch time. This is crunch time, really. But Josiah didn't even get to 40. He was taken out of the way by divine grace, not to see the terrible punishments that would fall upon his people that he'd tried so hard to save for so long. His father Ammon, of course, was removed out of the way, but I think his mother is worth a comment. His mother is Jedidah. Her name means the beloved, and I don't think there's any doubt that she has to have played a huge role in the development of Josiah. For him to turn out like he was, there had to be a strong influence from his mother. But of course there were other factors at work in the life of Josiah, and that was the friendship that he shared with Jeremiah. He was a very close friend and ally of Josiah. So I want you to have a look at Lamentations chapter 4 and verse 20, the Lamentations of Jeremiah, where I don't think there's any doubt Jeremiah makes reference to Josiah. Now if you look up the commentaries, the idiotic comments that are made here are almost unbelievable. The commentators will tell you that when you read in Lamentations 4 verse 20 about the breath of our nostrils, the anointed of Yahweh, that it's actually about Zedekiah. Oh, come on, give me a break. That's ridiculous. It can't be about anyone like Zedekiah or his predecessors, Jehoiakim or Jehoiachin. It's just not possible. Look at what it says in verse 20 of Lamentations 4. The breath of our nostrils, the anointed of Yahweh, was taken in their pits, of whom we said, under his shadow we shall live among the nations. Would they have said that? Could you have said that of Jehoiakim? No. Zedekiah? No. This is clearly a reference by Jeremiah to Josiah. When he came to the throne and grew up to be a man and instituted his first reformation, that's when people took a deep breath and said, at last, the breath of our nostrils. At last, there's a turn back to things that are right. And of course, it didn't work out. He was taken away early in the piece. But I don't think there's any doubt that they had great hopes that things might change under Josiah. Not even he was able to turn that people back to the way. 2 Chronicles 35 and verse 25 tells you what happened when Josiah died. 2 Chronicles chapter 35. And we read there, in verse 25, and Jeremiah lamented for Josiah. The word lamented there in the Hebrew means to lament, but it has the idea of striking a musical note. And Rotherham actually translates it, and Jeremiah chanted a dirge over Josiah. So the Lamentations weren't written about the death of Josiah, but I think he's mentioned there. But there was a separate lamentation by Jeremiah. He actually wrote a dirge, or a dirge is what you do at a funeral. And so he would have celebrated the life of Josiah and lamented his death. And it says here in verse 25, and all the singing men and singing women spake of Josiah in their lamentations to this day. So it went on. It just didn't happen for a day. It went on. They lamented him for a long period of time. And they made them, in fact, an ordinance in Israel. And behold, they are written in the Lamentations. Not necessarily the Lamentations of Jeremiah, but in the Lamentations that were written concerning Josiah. So it wasn't something that they just sort of said, oh, well, he's gone. There's just another one gone. They lamented the passing of this man. And of course, we know why. We can understand why. Because Josiah is an extraordinary case in Scriptures. An extraordinary case. He became king at a time of great falling away. There were 57 years of apostasy that preceded him, with a short break at the end of the life of Manasseh. There was divine judgment looming. The end was near. Babylonian religion had been wholly integrated into Judah. We know that from such passages as 2 Chronicles 33 verses 5 to 9. Most proponents of the truth had been silenced. They had been slaughtered by Manasseh, and no scrolls of the law were available. They had been destroyed by Manasseh. So for him to turn out like he was, we pointed out earlier, didn't we, in one of our early studies in this School of the Prophets, that he's the only king of Judah, of whom it is said that he turned not to the right hand or to the left, and he didn't have a book of the law to write out. So it's extraordinary when you look at this man. He became king at 8, and the record of 2 Kings 22 tells us about that. 2 Kings 22 verses 1 and 2. And of course, providence was at work to fulfill 1 Kings 13 verse 2. So when you come to the record of 2 Kings chapter 22, in verse 1 we read, Josiah was 8 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 31 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jedidah, the daughter of Adiah of Boscath. And he did that which was right in the sight of Yahweh, and walked in all the way of David his father, and turned not aside to the right hand or to the left. And there's that direct reference to Deuteronomy 17 and verse 20. So here is the arrival of the one who was foretold by the man of God from Judah 340 years before. What can you remember about 340 years ago? Zero. Yeah. Yeah. Nothing. Well, Here is one who was foretold 3.5 centuries before, who now turns up on the scene. What a marvellous thing is the foreknowledge of our God, that he could look down the track and see the arrival of this man who would be, as I said, I used the word extraordinary. I mean, he's one out of the box, isn't he? In an environment like that, to turn out like he did, without a Bible? How did that happen? Well, we're going to explore how that happened, because he had a support team. His name, Yah, his foundation. He had a support team. The palace courtiers were removed, and faithful men preserved by God to guide this boy king. He wanted to make sure that the prophecy was going to be fulfilled. The wheels were not going to fall off. But who could rule effectively at 8? Well, of course you couldn't. So there's his mother. We've pointed out her importance. Beloved of Yah is the meaning of her name. The daughter of Adiah. And Adiah means whom Yah hath adorned. And of course, this idea is picked up in the 1st of Peter chapter 3, verses 1 to 5, where Peter talks about the faithful women of old, who were not adorned like Jezebel, but they were adorned with a spirit of meekness. And that spirit of meekness, which was seen in Sarah, for example, and the way that she handled the difficulties with Abraham, that's the kind of adornment that Yahweh's looking for. You see, this woman, this mother of Josiah, effectively had an unbelieving husband, didn't she? An unbelieving husband, Ammon. So there were faithful elders, the support team that God used to make sure that Josiah had the right type of guidance and education. Men like Shaphan, the man whose name means a coney, and the coney is referred to in Proverbs chapter 30. Anyone remember the context of that? There are 4 things, 4 things that are very, very small in the scheme of things. The coney, this is like a rabbit-like creature. It's about the size of a rabbit, and it lives in the rocks and the holes in the rocks, and it buzzes out and looks around for its predators. It nibbles on some... It knows its vulnerability, all right? And it goes to the rocks for its security. Wisdom. This is the wisdom that God put in it. So here's a man who got through the murderous campaign of Manasseh. He somehow got through it. He was an older man, because you know, Shaphan had a number of very faithful children. He had some riders, 1 or 2 riders as well, but he had very faithful sons, this man. So he'd been around for a while. Gedaliah was a grandson of Shaphan. See, so this man had somehow negotiated that tortuous path where Manasseh was going around bumping off people that opposed him. That God had preserved him like a coney. Father of a very faithful family, and he was obviously Josiah's mentor. There was the high priest Hilkiah, whose name means the portion of Yah, who I don't think there's any question was the father of Jeremiah the prophet. And there were companions and supporters. There was Zephaniah, whom Yahweh hid. There was Jeremiah, of whom we've mentioned, whose name means whom Yah hath appointed. There was an advisor. As soon as he found the book of the law and read it and realised the consequences, the implications of that, he sent to Huldah the prophetess. Clearly, he had a relationship with her. And she was the wife of the man who looked after the wardrobe in the temple. This was the remnant of the school of the prophets. Right at the end of Judah's history, there was this woman, Huldah. So the keys to this and the lessons we need to learn from this is that at the end of the days, when the going gets tough, when the wheels begin to fall off in the brotherhood as they were in Judah, then we need to have sound companions, both old and of a similar age to ourselves. Jeremiah and Josiah and Zephaniah were of a similar age, but Shaphan and Hilkiah were older. And what we need to do, brethren, is to make sure we've got a good support network. Now, this is what schools of the prophets and other things that we attend produce, don't they? They produce that kind of network. You build up a confidence in each other. A confidence that you've got brethren alongside of you that are just as interested in the Word of God as you are. That they're just as interested in upholding what is right as you are. And so you build this network of support. And I tell you, it's very, very important. I have some brethren in my life who are my mentors. And I often will go to them and ask them questions. You know, you can get to a point where you think you know everything. The day will come when you realise you don't. And you need to go and talk to brethren who are further down the track than yourself, particularly when the going gets tough. So you need that, and that's what comes out of this. We have to have good companionships. You know what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 verse 33? Can someone look that verse up for me? 1 Corinthians 15 verse 33. He talks about this principle of companionship. Someone got it? Ralph, please.
Be not deceived, evil communications corrupt good manners.
What does that mean?
Evil company corrupts good habits.
Yeah, so you've got another translation there. Read it out for us, thanks, Chris.
Do not be deceived. Evil company corrupts good habits.
Yeah. Another translation says, bad companionships corrupt good morals. All right, and that's what that means. You've got the wrong kind of companions, and you're going to go their way. You're going to be corrupted by them. So good companionships is very important.
He who walks with wise men will be wise.
Exactly. Okay, so that's the principle that comes out of what we're considering here with Josiah. You need to develop those friendships in the truth, because the day will come when you'll have to lean heavily upon them. So, what we see in Josiah is a man, as we read in the Lamentations of Jeremiah, who bore the yoke in his youth. And if we come to the record of 2 Chronicles 34, we'll have a look and see what he does. Now, you don't find this record in Kings. You've got to come to 2 Chronicles 34. We read in Kings that he was 8 years old when he began to reign. Well, that's the message of verse 1. We read that he did that which was right. Verse 2 here says he walked in the ways of David his father. There's no mention of Ammon, of course. He walked in the ways of David his father and declined neither to the right hand nor the left. We read that in Kings. But we read this in Chronicles in verse 3. For in the 8th year of his reign, so he's 16 years of age, in the 8th year of his reign as a 16-year-old, while he was yet young, 16-year-olds sometimes think that they're mature, but God says they're young. All right. While he's yet young, he began to seek after the God of David his father. And in the 12th year, when he's 20 years of age, he began to purge Judah and Jerusalem from the high places and the groves and the carved images and the molten images. Now, he doesn't find the book of the law until he's 26 years of age. So what's motivating Josiah to do this? Well, I'm going to try and demonstrate what we believe was motivating this young man. As a 16-year-old, the influences that have been brought to bear upon him by Shaphan and Hilkiah and his friends Jeremiah and others, this is what begins to direct him to seek after the God of David his father and to leave behind the rubbish of his father Ammon and of his grandfather Manasseh when he was an apostate. And at age 20 he says, well, we're going to do something about this. So he starts a purge. Now, it's a pretty limited purge, this one. It just involves Jerusalem and its surrounds. It's a limited purge, not like the one that happens in his 18th year when he's 26. But it is a purge, and it requires personal dedication and involvement. And it's marked by a degree of thoroughness that is going to be fully shown in the second purge later on. He's influenced clearly by other spiritual young men, and one of those is Zephaniah. Zephaniah belonged to the royal family. And of course Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah the high priest, began to prophesy when Josiah was 21, in his 13th year. So clearly those influences were there, bearing down upon him. And then of course comes the 18th year of his reign, when he's 26, when the book of the law is found. This is the defining moment of Josiah's life. He was repairing the temple. And there's always a need, isn't there, for positive building in the house of God. And in that cleaning up of the temple of God, they find this book of the law. So there's a lesson there, isn't there? Clean up the temple of God and find the truth, as it were. Discover the power of the word for yourself. That's, I think, the message that comes through from this year of Josiah's life. In the record of 2 Chronicles 34, verses 26 and 27, which is where he sends the delegation to Huldah the prophetess, this is the answer of God. Now, we're not going to read the whole thing. It begins in verse 23. We're going to come down to verse 26. Because we read this. That Yahweh says through Huldah, "And as for the king of Judah who sent you to inquire of Yahweh, so shall ye say unto him, Thus saith Yahweh God of Israel, concerning the words which thou hast heard, because thine heart was tender, and thou didst humble thyself before thy God, when thou heardest his words against this place, and against the inhabitants thereof, and humblest thyself before me," notice the second mention of that, "and didst rend thy clothes, and weep before me, I have even heard thee also, saith Yahweh." So here is God saying to him, it was his humility in the face of what he read in the Word of God that was the key element as far as God was concerned. So one of Josiah's greatest characteristics was that fact. You know, we often quote Isaiah 66 verse 2, "To this man will I look, him that trembles at my word," you know, that is poor of spirit and trembles at my word. Well, that was the characteristic of Josiah. "Because thine heart was tender, and thou didst humble thyself before thy God, when thou heardest his words." That's the key element of his life. He had a companion, and that companion was Jeremiah. Jeremiah lived a life of affliction. His name signifies whom Yah has appointed. His father, the high priest, Hilkiah, "My portion is Yah." He was, of course, of the priests who lived in Anathoth, just a little north of Jerusalem. Anathoth means answers to prayer. It was this priestly town about 3 miles, if we're here in America, 3 miles north of Jerusalem. So Jeremiah was a priest, almost certainly, as I said, the son of the high priest of the day. He began prophesying, as we mentioned, in the 13th year of Josiah. He was about the same age as Josiah. He never married, and he never had any children. I want you to have a look at Jeremiah 16 verse 2. And when you're young and you're not married, that's one of the prospects that's before you. There are 2 great decisions you make in life. The first and most important is your baptism. You don't make that one, you're not going anywhere. You make the decision to get baptised, and the next thing you look for down the track is you're going to find a lovely young sister and marry and have a family. Yeah? That's normal, and that's good. And we all look forward to that, don't we? Well, God said to Jeremiah, "You're not doing it. You are not doing it." And he gave him a reason for it. In Jeremiah 16 verse 2. Verse 1 says, "The word of Yahweh came also unto me, saying, Thou shalt not take thee a wife, neither shalt thou have sons or daughters in this place." What's the reason? Why can't he marry and have a family? Verse 3. "For thus saith Yahweh concerning the sons and concerning the daughters that are born in this place, and concerning their mothers that bear them, and concerning their fathers that begat them in this land, they shall die of grievous deaths. They shall not be lamented, neither shall they be buried, but they shall be as dung upon the face of the earth, and they shall be consumed by the sword, by the famine, and their carcasses shall be meat for the fowls of heaven and for the beasts of the earth." And you see, he goes on to talk about the fact that God himself, who had married Israel, was going to have to be bereaved of her. She was going to go off into captivity. Now, Israel had become 2 parts, Israel and Judah, 2 women. All right? He had to give them a bill of divorcement, which wasn't about putting them away so he could marry someone else. Bill of divorcement in that day was simply putting her out of the house until she repented, and there was grounds for her to come back. Okay, that was what happened in the life of Hosea, you'll remember. So this man Jeremiah was never allowed to marry, never allowed to have a family. And he was rarely free from opposition all through his life, derision and persecution. He was a punching bag, was Jeremiah. They were always after him. That was not going to be a very, very happy life. Jeremiah is described by Smith's Bible Dictionary as the reluctant prophet. This is what they say about him. His character is most interesting. We find him sensitive to a most painful degree, timid, shy, hopeless, desponding, constantly complaining and dissatisfied with the course of events, but never flinching from duty. Timid in resolve, he was unflinching in execution. As fearless when he had to face the whole world as he was dispirited and prone to murmuring when alone with God. Judged by his own estimate of himself, he was feeble and his mission a failure. Really, in the hour of action and when duty called him, he was in very truth a defence city and an iron pillar and brazen walls against the whole land, which of course is a quotation from Jeremiah 1 verse 18. He was a noble example of the triumph of the moral over the physical nature. Now, of course, it's a Gentile commentary, but I don't think they've got too much wrong in that. When you read and study the life of Jeremiah, it's very much like that. And this man had to suffer a great deal, which is why, of course, he's a type of our Lord Jesus Christ. He said himself, when Yahweh said to him, you know what? Just come back to Jeremiah chapter 1. Because the same thing happened to Jeremiah that happened to Josiah. We read in Jeremiah 1 verse 6, maybe verse 5 and 6. Verse 4 tells us that God speaks to him saying, before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee. And before thou camest forth out of the womb, I sanctified thee. And I ordained thee a prophet unto the nations. So he's set apart. He's given a role as a prophet before he's born. Well, that's what Josiah was, wasn't it? Josiah was foretold 340 years before he was born. So they're very, very similar, these two men, and they were very close friends. They had similarly sad lives in many ways. The commentators have said, no prophet of God was at once more sure of his words, but at the same time so unsure of himself. And that was the prophet Jeremiah. But he had a job to do, and it wasn't a pleasant job. It was the job of Hosea 6 verse 5. Therefore have I hewed them by the prophets. Ever tried to hew something? You know, it's like hacking up a carcass or something. Yeah, it's not a pleasant job. I have hewed them by the prophets. I have slain them by the words of my mouth. And thy judgments are as the light that goeth forth. So that was the job of prophets like Jeremiah. It wasn't a pleasant task at all. So he says in verse 6 of chapter 1, Ah, Adonai Yahweh, behold, I cannot speak. I'm a child. But he's to be set over the nations. Now look at Jeremiah 1 verse 9. Then Yahweh put forth his hand and touched my mouth. And he said, Behold, I have put my words in thy mouth. So he was to be the spokesman, and he was to be set over the nations in the sense that the prophecies that he would deliver, and we read of in verse 10, See, I have this day set thee over the nations and over the kingdoms, to root out and to pull down and to destroy and to throw down, to build and to plant. Those prophecies would determine the destiny of nations. So he's appointed an overseer, so to speak, over the nations. And those prophecies would determine their ultimate destinies. Josiah's reformation, of course, was hewed. We made mention earlier of Jeremiah 3 verse 10. This is what God said through Jeremiah. He hewed them by the prophets. And yet for all this, her treacherous sister Judah hath not turned unto me with her whole heart, but feignedly. And the word in the Hebrew, as you can see, sheker, means deception. What deceives or disappoints or betrays one. And God was very disappointed by the hypocritical approach to those who were under Josiah's reformation. Now Josiah had two reformations. In his 12th year, aged 20, and after finding the book of the law in his 18th year, aged 26. And they were both a failure because the hearts of the people remained firmly locked into Manasseh's idolatry, that Nimrodian apostasy that we considered in our previous session. So what was God going to do about that? And what was it that stirred Josiah up to get rid of the remnants of that apostasy? Well, Jeremiah was one of the influences, undoubtedly. But there was another one, another friend of his who was a member of the royal household, Zephaniah, the prophet. I just want to spend a little time, and we did this a couple of years ago, or a portion of it, when we considered Nimrod. I want to do it again, just briefly. Have a look at the book of Zephaniah. Come to that book. So we come to Zephaniah, and I know that's page 1138 in the Oxford Bible, so I go straight there. I don't know what's in your Bible, but it's 1138. So here we've got the prophecy of Zephaniah. This is one of the most potent prophecies in the whole of the Old Testament. It is one of the most expansive prophecies as well. Zephaniah was a descendant of Hezekiah. You read that in verse 1. The word of Yahweh which came unto Zephaniah, the son of Cushai, the son of Gedaliah, the son of Amariah, the son of Hizkiah. The Hizkiah here, of course, is Hezekiah. So he's a member of the royal family. He has access to the king. He prophesied between 630 and 621 BC during the early years of Josiah's reign. And this is what we believe compelled Josiah to introduce his first reformation. He's contemporary with Jeremiah, who began prophesying in his 13th year, seemingly responsible for those early reforms. His name means whom Yah hath hid, and he's the son of Cushai. Now what Christadelphian with half a brain would name his son after the Pope? Anyone here? And when the current Pope, what's his name? The previous one was Benedict XVI. What's his name?
Francis.
That's right, Francis. He made himself after Francis of Assisi. But let's just take Benedict. Anybody here, when Benedict the 16th was the Pope, had a child, would name their son Benedict? Of course you wouldn't. No Christadelphian in their right mind would name their son after the Pope. Because Cushai, has been named after the Pope. Cush was the father of Nimrod. He's the architect of the Catholic Catechism. And so we've got, what does that tell you? Well, it tells us that in the period of Manasseh's rule and then Ammon's rule, when Babylonian apostasy was the order of the day, of course you would name your children after the Babylonian gods, wouldn't you? Yeah, and this guy did. So this shows you how deep the apostasy was. But interestingly enough, of course, Cush, the name, is mentioned 3 times in the prophecy of Zephaniah. Gedaliah, whom Yah has made great, Amariah, whom Yah has promised, Hezekiah, strengthened of Yah. So the underlying theme of the prophecy of Zephaniah is the salvation of a remnant whom God hid, the meaning of the name Zephaniah, among the Cushites, the apostate ecclesia, and made great through the one he promised to Abraham and strengthened for himself. We've just taken that from the names in verse 1. So let's just briefly analyse the prophecy of Zephaniah. Chapter 1 verse 1 to chapter 2 verse 3 we have the hastening judgments upon Judah. Chapter 2 verse 4 to 15, the judgment on the nations. Chapter 3 verses 1 to 7 we have the sins of Judah and Jerusalem. And chapter 3 verses 8 to 20 we have a remnant restored and redeemed. And the purpose of this prophecy, as we said, was to encourage a faithful remnant in the face of rapidly approaching divine judgment. And the roots of this prophecy are found back, like most things in the Word, in Genesis 1 to 35. Nimrod is in this book. His name is not mentioned, but he is omnipresent. The word Cush occurs 3 times, which of course refers to the presence of Babylon. The original Cush was the area of Babylon, wasn't it, in Genesis 2 verse 13. And we have references like this in this prophecy of Zephaniah. There are the towers and the cities of chapter 3 verse 6, the high towers of chapter 1 verse 16. The nations, the word nations, goyim, used 7 times. I will rise up to the prey, chapter 3 verse 8, a clear allusion to Nimrod the mighty hunter. The word safar, language, Zephaniah 3 verse 9, drawn straight from Genesis 11 verse 1, I will return to the peoples a pure safar, a pure lip. And there's reference to Nineveh and Assyria, chapter 2 verse 13, the military phase of the kingdom of men. And there are these direct contrasts made between Nimrod, the god of Manasseh, for 50 odd years, and Yahweh, to whom he turned at the end of his life. So you've got these references to Nimrod versus Yahweh. Genesis 10 verse 8, of course, he's called a mighty hunter, a Gibbor. That word is used in Zephaniah 3:17. He was the first God king, Genesis 10:10. And so the references in Zephaniah 3:15 to Yahweh as king. A hunter, the name, the word Shem, the language, all of these things point to the fact that Zephaniah is built around Nimrod. So Zephaniah is actually a giant stepping stone in the Word of God between Genesis and Revelation. So the message of Genesis about the rise of Nimrod and the rebellion and the confusion of the tongues finds its way into other prophecies, to Isaiah, to Jeremiah, to Daniel. But it's Zephaniah that is the major stepping stone between Genesis and the Apocalypse. And so if we had time, we could go through that in great detail and demonstrate that. But let's just have a look at what Zephaniah says about the sins of Judah and Jerusalem in Zephaniah 3. Zephaniah 3 verse 2 we read about this polluted, oppressing city of verse 1. She obeyed not the voice, she received not correction, she trusted not in Yahweh, she drew not near to her God. Now there are 4 elements there, aren't they? 4 elements to salvation that were lacking in Jerusalem and its inhabitants. There was the hearkening to the word, which provides motivation. There was the acceptance of correction, which requires humility. There was trusting in Yahweh, which sees dependence. And there was drawing near to God, which reveals a relationship. And those 4 things were lacking. And the culprits are spelled out in verses 3 and 4. And there are 4 leadership culprits here. The princes, the judges, the prophets, and the priests. Verse 3. Her princes within her are roaring lions. Her judges are evening wolves. They gnaw not the bones till the morrow, because they eat it all at once. Her prophets are light and treacherous persons. And the word persons is Enosh, weak mortal men. Her priests have polluted the sanctuary. They have done violence to the law. So these 4 classes of leaders have corrupted the nation. And in verse 5 there are 4 responses of the divine character. The just Yahweh is in the midst thereof. He will not do iniquity. Every morning doth he bring his judgment to light. He faileth not, but the unjust knoweth no shame. 4 responses from God. And in verse 6 there are 4 remedies. And those remedies, of course, are designed to eradicate Nimrod from the nation. I have cut off the nations. Their towers, the Tower of Babel, their towers are desolate. I made their streets waste, that none passeth by. Their cities are destroyed, so that there is no man, that there is none inhabitant. So God is going to provide a remedy. He's going to remove this nation off to Babylon, from whence they got their Babylonian apostasy, that they might be cleansed of idolatry. Now, I'm not going to say too much about the book of Zephaniah, but I do want to point to some really important passages, and this is one of them, in Zephaniah 3 verses 8 to 10. Now, this is the language that is built around Nimrod. Verse 8. Therefore wait ye upon me, saith Yahweh, until the day that I rise up to the prey. Isn't that interesting? That I rise up to the prey. That's exactly what Nimrod did. He rose up to the prey. For my determination is to gather the nations. Now the result of Nimrod's rebellion was to scatter the nations. He's going to gather the nations that I may assemble the kingdoms, to pour upon them mine indignation, even all my fierce anger, for all the earth shall be devoured with the fire of my jealousy. So verse 8 is about the nations being assembled for Armageddon and the subsequent judgments that follow. Verse 9 of Zephaniah 3 is about the nations being given a pure religion. That's what he means when he says, well, then will I turn to the peoples a pure safar, a pure lip. Because in Genesis chapter 11, the whole world had one lip or one understanding, the divine lip Hebrew. And that, of course, is the best language to offer praise. It's the best language for religion, they say. They all had the one lip. It was confused by Nimrod's rebellion. They're going to have that pure lip, that pure religion returned to them. And in verse 10, scattered Israel will be recovered from their dispersion. From beyond the rivers of Cush, that word Ethiopia is Cush in the Hebrew. From beyond the rivers of Cush, my suppliants, even the daughters of my dispersed, shall bring mine offering. But this is the verse I want to focus on, verse 8. This is Young's literal translation, slightly modified. Therefore wait for me, an affirmation of Yahweh, for the day of my rising for prey. For my judgment is to gather nations, to assemble kingdoms, to pour out on them mine indignation, all the heat of mine anger. For by the fire of my jealousy consumed is all the earth. And then the following verse says, for then do I turn unto peoples a pure lip, to call all of them by the name of Yahweh, to serve him with one shoulder. One shekem is the Hebrew word. So why is this little passage so important, do you think? Well, it's important because verse 8 is one of the most astonishing verses in the Old Testament. This verse, which is one sentence in the Hebrew, contains every letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and there are 22 of them, including what are called the 5 final letters. So there are 22 fundamental, basic letters of the Hebrew alphabet. But there are also these final letters, which is one of the 22, but they've got a little squiggle on the bottom. So they're finals. So there's a total of 27. These 27 letters of the alphabet are used at least once in the verse. Give me a sentence using every letter of the English alphabet.
Quick brown jump off over the lazy dog.
How much rubbish is that? Right? What does that mean? Yeah, it's true. We can do it, can't we? We learn that at school. But that's rubbish. I mean, what does it mean? This is the divine language. Every letter of the alphabet, including the final letters, in one sentence. And it's very, very important to us. 27, of course, is 3 times 9. 3 times 9, if you turn the 9 upside down, what do you get? 666, of course. 27 equals 10 plus 17. Now, 10, of course, stands for all. 17 to a Hebrew meant absolute completeness. You don't believe me? Just add 1 to 17 together and you get 153. Okay? Talking to Robbie about that. It's a very, very important number. 17 is the 7th prime number in the divine scheme. Prime number is a number you can't divide except by itself. Alright? It's the 7th prime number. You know what the 6th is? 13. Rebellion, the number of Nimrod. So here we've got God saying he's going to bring Nimrod's rebellion ultimately to an end. So this is all about total fullness and finality. So it's an astounding passage in the scripture which speaks of the time, which is very near, of course, when all that Nimrod stands for, all that was brought into Judah by Manasseh, all of that stuff is going to disappear from the face of the earth. It's going to disappear from God's people because in verse 10 he speaks of the work of Elijah, who goes forth to bring his people from beyond the rivers of Cush and to bring them back into the land in the second Exodus of Israel. I want to finish on one simple note about Josiah. In 2 Chronicles 34:28, God said to him through hold of the prophetess, "Behold, I will gather thee to thy fathers, and thou shalt be gathered to thy grave in peace. Neither shall thine eyes see all the evil that I will bring upon this place and upon the inhabitants of the same." Now, if God said that to you when you were 26 years of age, and he said, "Right, I'm going to kill you," you probably think that's pretty tough. It is the very best thing that could have happened to Josiah. It's like when John the Baptist was in prison. The very best thing that could happen to John the Baptist is that without him knowing, he heard all the commotion upstairs. I've been to the place where he was put to death by Herod. It's only got two levels. You've got the upper palace level and you've got the lower dungeon level. The first thing that John the Baptist hears is footsteps on the stone steps coming down to the dungeon. The next thing, the key goes in the door swings open, the soldier walks in and says, "Bend over," bang, gone. Best thing could have happened to him. And the same thing happens to Josiah. And that's what Isaiah 57 verses 1 and 2 tells us. Isaiah 57 1 and 2 says, "The righteous perisheth, and no man layeth it to heart. And merciful men, like Josiah, are taken away, none considering that the righteous is taken away from the evil to come. He shall enter into peace. They shall rest in their beds, each one walking in his uprightness." And we know, of course, that God is not the God of the dead, is he? He's the God of the living. And the next waking moment for Josiah will be when the angel wakes him up from death and he finds himself in the presence of the one, the only one who can resolve the problems of his people and of the world. It's going to be a great and wonderful day for Josiah. And he's going to be in the kingdom because he was an extraordinary man. So what's our challenge in that, brethren? None of us are really extraordinary, are we? None of us. But we can do a little better. I'm sure we can do a little better. And that's the lesson we should take from this man's life. We can't be extraordinary in these days of failure and decline. Let's just do a little better in the days that are left to us from now on. Let's take that message to bed tonight. Let's think about this man Josiah, because one day very soon we are going to see him.
BibleTruthAndProphecy.com is a worldwide collaboration by Christadelphians to help promote the understanding of God's Word to those who are seeking the truth about the human condition and God's plan and purpose with this earth and with mankind upon it. Bible Truth and Prophecy is part of a wider set of online resources provided by Christadelphianvideo.org for establishing just how far removed the true Christian teaching of the first century apostles is from that taught by mainstream Christendom today. BibleTruthAndProphecy.com is very much a standalone website, but benefits from our vast network of sites and resources and social media. Here are just a few of the things that BibleTruthAndProphecy.com offers. We have a good number of written articles supplied to us from brothers from all over the globe. These deal with first principle issues, creation versus evolution, the inspiration of the Bible, and so much more. We have a whole section of video study series. These are studies that have been posted onto our YouTube channel but because of the difficulty of the search feature within YouTube, we have chosen to host on Bible Truth and Prophecy. So now every video you search for within the site, you can be guaranteed that it will be of a Christadelphian nature. We also have a preaching video section where any ecclesia is invited to download and use or embed these videos within their own ecclesial websites. We also have an exhortation service where we produce 2 or 3 exhortations per week, which we then circulate to brethren and sisters in isolation. We also have an ever-growing list of approved Christadelphian sites. We also have a page of live news feeds, so you can keep up to date with all the breaking news as it happens. We also have a section for the daily readings. Each day at around midnight we publish all 3 of the daily readings, and then later on in the day we publish thought for the days, often based on all 3 portions of the daily readings. Within each daily reading post there is also a link to enable you to have the Bible chapter read to you directly. We also feature Bible in the News videos which we have produced from the Bible in the News website. We also feature Brother Don Pierce's milestone snippets, which come out approximately 3 times a week. We also feature Andy Walton's weekly World Watch, and other commentaries and analysis from other brethren on world news events. You can also subscribe to the blog and be notified of posts as they happen in real time, and also subscribe to the weekly newsletter, which is provided by Christadelphianvideo.org. Every page and post on the site has the facility to be able to leave a comment or make an observation, so please take advantage of this and let us know what you think of the site.